Hey, how's everybody doing? This is Suzanne again for Suzanne's Tutoring. You are probably watching this on YouTube, where you can find my channel at YouTube/Suzanne's Tutoring. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And when you're looking for me, just look for the big red S. You can also find my website at Suzanne'sTutoring.com. So, yes, I am now available on YouTube and on my website. You're getting some free study tips, the free PDF downloads, free tutorial playlists, and there are never any ads, there are never any fees, there are no memberships to sign up for, there are no forms to fill out. No kidding. I don't ask for your personal information at all because it's none of my business.
Okay, so when we are studying with two major goals in mind. One is to understand the things, and two is to remember the things. And as I said before, a little bit later in this section, this is part two, I'm going to explain to you why it's so important to do number one, to make sure you're understanding the things, and how that is going to really help you to remember the things. So first, we have to concentrate on understanding what's going on first before we can even worry about memorization. Memorization comes later. First, you got to understand what's going on. So the first thing is to understand the things, and really, really absorb that word understand. Because this is not about being able to just regurgitate a couple of sentences from your textbook or some vocabulary words that your teacher talked about. When you get to college, and especially when you're in STEM classes, they want you to be able to apply this information. So speaking of, the entire concept of understanding encompasses these 4 points. You have to, in order to understand something, you have to understand what the things are. You have to understand how the things work. You need to understand how the things all fit together. And finally, last but not least, you need to understand how to apply this information. What does it all mean? What does it all mean? And you have to do all of that in order to remember the things, which is number two in our two major goals. So let's talk about conceptual understanding first. Conceptual understanding. Well, we know what understanding means, but think about conceptual. The word conceptual comes from the word concept. It's a concept. So it's not a tangible object. It's not an orange or an apple or a desk or a chair. It's a concept. It's an idea. It's a complex of ideas, of many ideas, all woven together. So when you study for conceptual understanding, you want to get the theory behind the facts. And I'm going to outline this behind, because this is very important. The theory behind the facts. You have to be able to explain the why. It's not enough, if you're taking anatomy and physiology for, pre-med or for nursing or something, it's not enough for you to just go, oh, well, bones are hard because they're calcified. Well, why are they calcified? Because they're hard. You can't just have circular logic like that. You have to understand the theory behind how bones become calcified and why that calcification process makes the bones harder than concrete. You have to be able to know why that happens, or how that happens. A lot of scientists choose to use the word how instead of why, because how is more of a descriptor for the actual physical process taking place for something to exist, if that makes any sense, as opposed to why. A lot of scientists try to stay away from that word why, because that ends up turning into, well, why do we exist? And then that gets into religion and beliefs and things that are beyond the scope of scientific investigation. So a lot of scientists choose to use the word how. I just use the word why just because it's like, you know what I'm talking about if I say why. I'm not asking you, why do we exist, or debating a philosophical debate about the existence of things or God or anything. I'm just asking you, why does something work? Why does a toaster work? Well, because we plug it in and the electricity comes in, but you could just very well say how. Now, with understanding, there are 4 basic tent poles, I like to call them. You need to gravitate towards these 4 things when you're studying in order to understand it. Now, so the first is going to be your vocabulary. You need to know what things are called, right? Know the lingo. Look it up, Buttercup. If you don't know what a word means, look it up. Do not try to just guess what the word means from the context of what you're reading, because you're reading new information. 2, demonstration by yourself. And by demonstration, what I mean is, if you play it out, you can draw it out, draw out a diagram of what's going on, or draw a flow chart, or even I know people who will build stuff with Legos. When I'm in organic chemistry, we actually have little erector sets, like Lego sets, that are specifically for organic chemistry. So you can actually piece the molecules together, piece the atoms together, and make the organic molecules. So you can see how that looks in 3 dimensions, and you can turn it around, and you can see how it actually looks, and how the bonds stick out and the atoms stick out from the central carbon and all of that. So demonstration, a model of something, or you can draw it out on a piece of paper. Number 3 is organization. How are you organizing this information that you're getting? Okay, so you're getting all these vocabulary words, and you're getting all of these diagrams that you're drawing out and labeling, and hopefully color coding. If you saw my part 1, color code your notes. But what does this organization mean? Well, the organization is about pretty much how you're going to mentally file all this information. And a lot of times when we're learning something, if we don't know exactly the context in which we're learning this, our brains could misfile that into, the wrong place, the wrong figurative file folder in our head. And so it's just going to be that much harder to access and to apply to the other information that we're studying. So organizing your notes is so, so important, especially when it comes to STEM subjects, especially biology. I will tell you, half of getting a good grade in biology is the way you organize your notes. So, and I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. Speaking of, Number four, in order to understand something, you have to be able to see it in use. You need to see it in action. And the best way you can see that, especially when it's new information, is to see somebody else use it so you can kind of get the gist of why it's used that way. So, like, especially like in math class, a lot of my math students that come to me, they think they're bad in math, but once I show them an example of how to use a certain formula or something, they got it. I show them once and they're like, oh, okay. And then I have them sit there and they do practice problems, because then you have to practice it out yourself, because it takes practice to get it right. But it's that a lot of times, especially in math class or something like a laboratory class where you have to follow a certain series of steps, it's just so beneficial and helps with your understanding if you can just see somebody else do it first and see what it is they're talking about in this piece of paper, in this textbook you're trying to read. If you could actually see it played out in real life and how people use this and how people do this in real life, then it's a lot easier. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. So in order to understand something, you need to know the vocabulary. You need to be able to like draw it out or demonstrate it out, like using models or like our organic chemistry models or our anatomy and physiology, the bone room models, or just to draw it out on a piece of paper, draw out a diagram. You need to organize your notes correctly. So if you have an organized notes, you have an organized mind. Also, you want to make sure you get to see some examples of this, which YouTube has videos for everything. So don't disqualify YouTube for when you are studying and you feel like you need to see somebody do it instead of just reading this piece of paper about it. Just go to YouTube and look and see how other people are doing it. All right, so to go into these 4 points a little bit more, let's go take the first one, vocabulary. Make your own dictionary. I can't stress this enough. Make your own glossary or dictionary or whatever you want to call it. And I usually do it in the back of my notebook, like whatever notebook I'm using to take notes for class. I'll just go to the back of the notebook, or sometimes I don't use a physical paper notebook. I'll use like Microsoft OneNote or something, but I'll designate like a space, a couple of pages in the back. And every time I run into a vocabulary word for that chapter, or even if it's not a vocabulary word and I just don't understand what the word means, I hadn't heard it before, then I look it up and I make sure I understand it, and I make sure I can say it in my own words. I don't just repeat back the exact same thing I read. I can like rephrase it and actually explain what it means, and then I write that down and make my own little glossary or make my own little dictionary in the back of my notebook. And that way, if you don't understand the words that are being used while you're reading, then you're not going to understand the end result. And if you've ever, how many people, raise your hand at home if you have ever gotten to the bottom of a page that you were reading and you have no idea what it was that you just read. You know you read it. You know you read from top to bottom this page in this textbook, but you get to the bottom and you're like, I have no idea what I just read. And you're like, were my eyes just going over the words and I wasn't processing anything? Well, chances are the reason why that usually happens, also it's the same reason why people fall asleep while they read, is because you go by a word that you don't understand somewhere at the top of the page and you don't understand it, but you kind of ignore the fact that you don't understand it and you keep reading. But inside your mind, your brain kind of pops out and goes, hey, wait a minute, what does that word mean? And it keeps thinking about that word, and so your brain is preoccupied trying to figure out what that word meant 2 paragraphs ago, while your eyes are trying to go over these other words, while your eyes are trying to get to the end of the page. Your brain is not processing what your eyes are looking at anymore. Your brain is back at the beginning of the page, still wondering what the heck that word meant. And so you have to, satisfy your brain, quench your brain's thirst, and find out what that word means, find out why the authors are using that word in that sentence like that, and then you can go on, and then you'll have a better understanding of what the text is actually saying. You never want to read past a word or term that you don't know. And don't guess what it means by the context. I already went over that, because if it's new information to you, how are you the authority of figuring out what the word's supposed to mean? You're reading new information. You don't know. And watch out for specialized terms, because a lot of times a word could be like just a normal word you use every day that means one thing. But if you're in a specialized class like biology or something, or anatomy and physiology, that word could mean something very, very specific in that field when they use that term. Or vice versa. It could sound like this fancy special word because you don't use it in everyday life, and come to find out it's just like a general term that means, it means smooth bones or something. You're thinking it's like a specific part of the body, but it's actually not. It just means it's smooth. It's just a fancy word. So, and science and math people who write these textbooks love to sound fancy when they write this stuff, so they're going to use fancy words all over the place. So just get used to it, because you have to be able to speak the lingo when you go out into the working world, so, people don't second guess your education. So just get used to learning these fancy words and being able to use them not awkwardly. But watch out for these specialized terms and find out, is that just a general term that means any old bone that's smooth, or are we just talking about, the kneecap that's smooth, or, what does this actually apply to? How do we actually use this word? Now, when you're doing this, before, and I think I covered this a little bit, before you study the new chapter, and remember, we're using our syllabus and we're using our planner, and we're studying ahead of the game. So we're studying for what is going to be lectured on next class. You don't wait until the lecture in class and then you go home and you study it. You study before that lecture comes up, so when you attend class and the teacher is giving a lecture, you already have kind of an idea of what they're talking about, and it helps so much. I can't even begin to express to you how much it helps. So before studying each new chapter, let's say like you have class tomorrow and the lecture tomorrow is on chapter 10 in whatever book you have for that class. So you go to that chapter, and you don't have to study the entire chapter. You don't have to like go down 15 rabbit holes and spend your entire day studying one chapter in a text, but you go to the either the beginning or the ending of each chapter is going to have usually like a summary of what that chapter was about and another page where it just lists the vocabulary words. And so go through those vocabulary words and make sure you understand what all those vocabulary words mean the day before that lecture is scheduled for class. Those are the words that you definitely want to enter into your own little homemade dictionary or glossary that you're making with these vocabulary words. And so study those first, and then when you get into class and the teacher's lecturing and they're using these fancy pants vocabulary words, you won't be lost. You won't feel like it's over your head because you'll actually know the words that they're talking about. Now, how do you deal with these fancy pants big old words? And this has helped me tremendously throughout my life. I can't even tell you. You break apart big words into their prefix, their root, and their suffix. And so, like, if you have periosteum, periosteum. Well, what does periosteum mean? Well, we don't have to figure out what periosteum means. We don't have to memorize a million different long words. All we have to do is know what the prefix means, and the root means, and the suffix means. And it's just a prefix, root, and suffix salad. All these words are just made up of the exact same prefixes, roots, and suffixes, just rearranged. So you get millions of words, but they're only made with a few building blocks. And so if you learn the building blocks instead of just each individual word, then you're going to be more prepared and more literate when you go to read this stuff. So for periosteum, the prefix is peri. Okay? And peri means around or surrounding. Surrounding. And then ost is just anything having to do with bones. Okay, so bones. And then the E is just there because you need a vowel in between the ost and the in order to make the word flow. Like periosteum would sound kind of weird, and that might be a different word for something meaning something else. But periosteum, so or eum is going to be the suffix. This is just an adverbial clause. The meaning it's pertaining to, it's about. So periosteum is a word that means about whatever is surrounding the bones, which is true because if you have, say, you have a bone. If you were to dissect a human and you pull this bone out, it's not going to look like this. It's actually going to be wrapped in like kind of a blanket kind of thing around the outside of the bone. The bone is kind of like protected in this little protective blanket that is wrapped around the middle of the bone there like that you have to actually kind of Velcro off, and it peels off kind of like Velcro in order to get to the bone. And that, my friends, that blanket around the bone is a periosteum. Now, a word on pronunciation. All too often, a student comes in and they can't pronounce a word, so they just kind of mumble through it and just to try to get to the next word. Say the word out loud. Pronunciation is important, and it's not so important that you need to get pronunciation correct or correctly, because once you go out into the field wherever you're going to work, you're going to hear other people pronounce it, and you're going to go, oh, that's how that's pronounced, and you're going to learn like that. So and you don't get counted off points in class for pronunciation, but you do get counted off in class. You do get counted off points for bad spelling sometimes when you're spelling specific technical words. So you say the word out loud, pronounce the word like it's spelled, or like it helps, or like it's going to remind you how to spell it. So therefore, you can at least spell the word, and you'll learn how to actually pronounce it later. And there's different dialects, and there's different parts of the country people pronounce things differently anyway. So that's not that big of a deal. But the spelling is. So the best advice I got from a teacher about learning to spell things correctly is if you pronounce it like it's spelled to you, that's going to teach you how to spell it correctly. So don't just mumble through words you don't know how to pronounce. Actually take the time to figure out what those words mean and how you're going to pronounce it. Now here is a demonstration about demonstration. So you can see this girl is not happy, trying to do this math homework and freaking out. And she's trying to think of all of this stuff in her head by what she's reading in the text. Especially when you get to do math and science, it's not a good idea to just try to keep everything in your head and like figure it out in your head, because you can get confused real easily, especially the farther advanced you get into the field. So here's what she's reading. So let's see if we'd feel the same way. A bus leaves the school to take students on a field trip. The bus travels 10 kilometers south, 10 kilometers west, another 5 kilometers south, and 15 kilometers north. To return to the school, in which direction does the bus have to travel? How many kilometers must it travel in that direction? Oh my goodness, my head's already starting to spin, and I feel like I need a nap already, right? Well, if you just draw it out instead of trying to just keep all of that in your head, here is if she would have drawn it out instead of just trying to do all of that in her head, she would be much happier of a student. That's the student that was in the picture. Because here's the same problem. A bus leaves the school to take students on a field trip. Okay, well, here's the school. So this is your starting point. And I guess they have it down here. So here's your starting point. The bus leaves the school to take the students on a field trip. Well, the bus travels 10 kilometers south. So here it goes, 10 kilometers down to here. Here's 10 kilometers south. And then 10 kilometers west. So it goes the same amount as it just went, but it's going west instead of south. And then another 5 kilometers south. So it makes a left turn and it goes back down again for 5 kilometers. And then 15 kilometers north. So I guess it pulls a U-turn or something? I don't know. So here's the 10 kilometers and here's another 5. So 15 kilometers north. And so here's the field trip. So this is where they end up at. And look how I have these labeled. I have this 10 kilometers pointing down, and 10 kilometers pointing west, 5 kilometers pointing south, and then 15 kilometers pointing north. Now, to return to school, in which direction does the bus have to travel? Well, now here's the bus is over here at the field trip, right? So the bus didn't have to do all of that weird stuff. I don't know what GPS they were following. It was probably Waze, but they did this roundabout weird way of getting to this field trip because all the bus has to do to go back to the school is go bloop to the east just to get back to the school. There's no turns needed or anything. And then it says how many kilometers must it travel in that direction. Well, the distance between this field trip here and the school here, this is the same distance that the bus traveled down here when it was going away, when it was going on the way to the field trip, just from here to here. And so how far was that? That was 10 kilometers west. So the bus is only going to have to drive 10 kilometers east. And if you don't understand this actual math problem, that's totally fine. Sometimes it takes a minute to sink in. I'm just using this as an example that it is so much easier to draw this stuff out on paper or draw diagrams instead of trying to keep it all in your head like this. Poor girl. Okay, now also, if you organize the material, you will organize your thoughts. If you have organized notes, you will have organized assignments and organized understanding of whatever it is you're studying. So you can do flowcharts, compare and contrast diagrams, tables. You can do outlines, concept maps, summaries. It's up to you, and it's not one size fits all. It depends on what class you're in, because I would do a flowchart class for my anatomy and physiology, but I wouldn't do that same flowchart class for math or philosophy or something. It just depends on what subject you're doing and how well you understand it, and also what the teacher is trying to teach you, what you're supposed to be learning from it. Because if you're supposed to be learning the process of where the blood flows in your veins and in your arteries from your heart out and then come back in, that's one thing that you need to learn from it. Or if they're just trying to teach you the structure of the heart and what the names are for all the structures in the heart, that's a totally different thing. So let's see some examples I can show you. So as I was talking about blood circulation in the heart, so here would be a flow chart, and we're going to start here at the superior and inferior vena cava, which is this big old vein that goes up and down your body, and then it comes up to your heart. So the blood flows in from the top and the bottom of the superior and inferior vena cava. It comes into the heart, into the right atrium, which is right there. It comes into the right atrium, and then it goes through the tricuspid valve down to the right ventricle. And then it goes through the pulmonary valve, and it splits off, and it goes out into the lungs. And then it gets some oxygen, and it gets rid of carbon dioxide, it gets oxygen, turns back to red, so it comes back through the pulmonary veins from the lungs, and this time it goes into the left atrium. And then that goes through a valve into the left ventricle. And then that ventricle shoots up and goes up into the aorta, the biggest artery we have in our entire body, and the aorta goes all over the place, and then it branches off so we can get blood circulation to our arms and legs and all that. And so this would be the flow chart that describes this. And so if I needed to learn the flow, the process of where the blood all goes, then this would be a good way to do it. Now let's look at a different way. Let's look at if I would have just put an outline for this and if that would have worked. Okay, so here's the outline of the blood circulation in the heart. So the Roman numeral 1, is there are 4 chambers in the heart. And then we have capital letters to designate the 4 different chambers. We have the left atrium, the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle. And then double I, so that's Roman numeral 2, there are 2 types of valves. There's the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. Now you see, you can already tell that this is not going to have anything to do with where the blood is actually going in these organs. So what we wanted the first thing, we wanted the flow chart if we need to learn where the blood goes in the body. So see, it's up to you. You're going to have to, know what is going on in class enough to know what you need to be studying and how you need to be studying it, so you can correctly choose the organizational way you're going to put this information into notes. Okay? Oh, and watch more movies, because you can watch movies of the exact same thing. But if you watch different movies with different people explaining the exact same thing, it might help you expand your understanding of it. Because one person could explain it one way, and you're like, man, okay, I guess I get it. But another person could explain it in a different way, and that really triggers something with you, in a good trigger. You're like, oh my gosh, since you said it like that makes so much more sense. So watch different movies explaining the same thing if you're having a hard time understanding what's going on. So now remember, we were studying, there's 2 major goals: to understand the things and to remember the things. And here is where we get to the good news that I was talking about. The good news is that the understanding brings, it brings understanding. It brings your comprehension of how things work and what's going on with this and what's the big picture and what's the small picture. You're getting the logical flow, the logical context of whatever it is you're studying. And so if things make logical sense because you logically understand the logic of it, then there's a lot less need to just memorize random facts, because you're not memorizing random facts. It's a logical. You're not memorizing something just to give an answer, the correct answer on a test. You could be asked this question, and it's just a logical conclusion that you would draw based on what you know, because you have a good understanding of the material. Now, that being said, there are times where you do need to just memorize some stuff. So you need to find fun tricks to help memorization. So like mnemonics is when like the first letter of each word turns into like a sentence or something. There's one for the cranial nerves, which is which ends in big brains matter most. But the actual original mnemonic was not big brains matter most. It was big something else matters most, because they need a B in there. But we changed it to big brains because I don't want to get fired by having a big poster on the wall at school in a classroom with something sexist. But that actually brings me to my next point, because if you do something, if you memorize, if you use something that's more shocking, and you do use something that's like triggering or shocking or not PC or just kind of weird. I mean, don't be mean to people or anything, but just something that's like out of the ballpark, just kind of weird or taboo or not allowed or something, then you're going to remember it better. Then when we're balancing chemical formulas in chemistry, in basic chemistry, and I'm tutoring students doing that, they always have a problem because they're balancing, going back and forth and back and forth, and I always whisper to them, I go, hey, save your hose for last, and they're like, what? And I'm like, save your hose for last, because you want to balance all of the elements first before you balance hydrogen, and then you balance oxygen very, very last. Because if you don't do that, if you balance hydrogen and oxygen first, you're going to be going around and around in circles forever with that formula. So in order to be able to balance the formula without getting tripped up, you balance everything except for hydrogen and oxygen, and then you do hydrogen second to last, and then oxygen last. So H-O, ho. So I say, hey, baby, save your hose for last. Well, it's not. I mean, I could get in trouble for it. I could probably get sent to HR for it, if I were to shout that across the room and somebody hears me. But, my students who I know I'm not going to, trigger or hurt by saying that, that's what I say. And then they get a big laugh out of it. They're like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. And it sticks, and they remember it. And I'll talk to them like 6 months, a year later, and they still remember, save your hose for last, Miss Suzanne, I remember, save your hose for last. And they remember how to balance those equations, and they remember that trick to it. Because it's a shocking thing for me to say. I'm like this nice teacher or whatever, and then I'm talking about your hose. So a lot of times shocking, things that, hit you weird or triggering things, that's what you want to use that to your power. You want to lean into triggers, but I mean, not something that's going to hurt you, but you want to lean into your triggers. That's your superpower, because if you can get triggered by hearing one thing and it makes you think this other thing, that's going to be able to help you memorize that. Oh, and by the way, no matter how good of a mnemonic you have or how good of a memory trigger you have, it takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. What does it take? Oh, and by the way, no matter how good of a mnemonic you have or how good of a memory trigger you have, it takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. What does it take? Oh, and by the way, no matter how good of a mnemonic you have or how good of a memory trigger you have, it takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. What does it take? Oh, and by the way, no matter how good of a mnemonic you have or how good of a memory trigger you have, it takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. It takes repetition to remember. What does it take? Repetition. It takes repetition to remember. You must repeat this stuff. You cannot cram it all in your head in one night, go in and take the test, and expect yourself to recall all that information. You have to repeat it. Actors, to memorize lines, they sit around all day and go over and say their lines over and over and over and over, and over again so they can remember it. Even the best actors. Nobody sits down and reads it once and then just has it all memorized. So that's it for me lecturing you on how to do a good job, because you're probably already doing a good job. But, don't forget that your tutoring at school is already bought and paid for. It is part of your tuition. You've already paid for it. So get your money's worth. Don't leave that money on the table like that. Get your money's worth. Even if you're not having a problem in the class, tutoring is not just for people having problems in the class. Tutoring is just, once or twice a week, catch up, just kind of going in and being able to bounce your ideas and bounce your work off of another person who knows what they're doing, so they can give you feedback outside of class. And it helps so much. And it actually cuts your time in half studying when you have somebody else there who can, sometimes guide you through it, but you don't really want to guide. You want more of a soundboard. You want to be able to bounce your ideas off of them. So you got this. Go to my website. A lot of my videos on YouTube, the notes that I use to do the videos, are downloadable PDFs on my website. I do not charge anything. I do not hit you up for money. I do not ask you to put in your personal information. You don't sign up for a membership. There's no ads, nothing. It's absolutely free and no strings attached. So have a great one, really, and like and subscribe this, please, and pass this on to your friends, because I started Suzanne's Tutoring for you guys, for y'all, for you folks. I started Suzanne's Tutoring because I saw this need, and it really makes me feel good knowing that this helps people. So please, by all means, pass along the word, get my website name out there, my YouTube, share my YouTube channel, and leave a comment, send me an email. If you have a request for a video I don't have, I would love to hear about it, and I will try to get that out as soon as I can. I'll try to answer any of your questions as soon as I can, too, so just leave a comment on the video. Thanks a lot.